Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lisa Jacobson, and I am president of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. I am very happy to be the moderator today for our executive dialogue briefing. The title for today's executive dialogue is Creating an Accelerated, Lasting Trajectory for Energy Efficiency Deployment. Energy efficiency is a critical foundation for decarbonization, yet its scale-up often requires coordinated and sustained commitment among multiple public and private stakeholders. In a time of transition in the energy sector, innovative advancement in clean energy technologies, and drastic political fluctuations, how can we accelerate energy efficiency deployment while ensuring lasting change? What policies and programs around the world have seen the greatest success, and what lessons can be learned from their experiences? That's what we're going to discuss today, and I'm really grateful that we have three excellent speakers with us today to help us with that conversation. I'd like to introduce them to you. First is Bob Hinkle, President and CEO of Metrus Energy. Next is Brian Dean, Lead for Energy Efficiency and Cooling at SEforALL. And Doug Johnson, Vice President and Technology Policy Officer at the Consumer Technology Association. So to get us started today, I'm going to ask each of the speakers in turn a few contextual, big picture questions. The first will be to introduce themselves to all of you. The second will be to share some of the challenges and barriers that they see their sector facing as they try to scale up deployment. And third will be at a high level, what kind of policies are they looking at to overcome those challenges? So I'm going to start with Bob. And Bob, I'd love it if you could, introduce yourself to our audience and explain how Metrus Energy fits into the energy efficiency marketplace.
Great. Well, thanks. And thanks to the Alliance for the opportunity to speak here today. Excited to be on the panel. So Bob Hinkle, President and CEO of Metrus Energy, and I've been working in the energy efficiency space for over 20 years, focusing on both the development and financing of energy efficiency projects and utility programs, both in the U.S. and overseas, particularly in emerging markets. And I founded Metrus back in 2009, and just some quick background on Metrus. We're a developer, financer, and an owner of larger scale energy efficiency upgrades and renewable energy projects. And we typically work for larger commercial industrial manufacturing customers in the Fortune 1000 space, but also schools and hospitals and public sector entities as well. We deliver energy efficiency as a service through our Sustainable Energy Services Agreement, or SESA, which is very analogous, I think, and familiar to folks that know a solar power purchase agreement. So it's a third-party financing and ownership structure with a pay-for-performance element to it. So under our SESA, we fund 100% of the upfront costs of a retrofit project or a renewable energy project. We own the assets and then bill customers based on measured ongoing performance in terms of energy savings and renewable energy that's generated. We're casting a pretty wide net in terms of the types of projects that we're financing and implementing, generally looking at multi-measure integrated retrofits that include electric and thermal energy savings. So going, speaking to the deployment challenge, trying to go after deeper energy retrofits that are getting larger savings, as well as deeper reductions in carbon. And in terms of projects that we have projects in 26 different states across the US, and that includes over 30 different types of energy efficiency measures that are included within our portfolio of projects. The, perspective a little bit that I have today is obviously one from a third-party financer and owner of energy efficiency and renewable energy assets, but also from, I think, a sustainability lens where at Metrus, we only make investments that are climate positive, and by that I mean projects that are reducing CO2 on a net basis at customers' sites or buildings. So that's something that we view with each project. And really, maybe more specifically, coming at things from the perspective of trying to treat energy efficiency as a resource that should be bought and sold, much like supply side energy that's coming from your utility. So excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Bob. Next, Brian, welcome. And please tell us a little bit about Sustainable Energy for All and your role there.
Yes, hello everyone. Yeah, I'm the head of energy efficiency and cooling at SEforALL, and SEforALL stands for Sustainable Energy for All, which many of you may know is as Sustainable Development Goal number 7. And my role is really, you could say, making sure that we achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7.3, which of course is doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvement. And obviously to do that, there's a lot of acceleration that's needed. So SEforALL is partnered with a number of organizations around the world through the Energy Efficiency Accelerator platform, and recently came together with more countries and partners through the 3% Club to achieve the 3% rate of improvement on energy efficiency to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7.3. Through this work with our other partners, really our goal is to take the best practices and lessons learned, like the great work that Bob is doing, and be able to bring that to other developing countries around the world that may have limited resources and limited ability to find the right solution. So that's what we're really looking to do, and we are doing, is working with countries around the world to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 7.
Well, terrific. Thank you. I appreciate that. So Doug, tell us a little bit about Consumer Technology Association and its interaction with energy efficiency and your role there.
Sure, happy to. And thanks again to the Alliance to Save Energy for organizing this online conference and for the opportunity to participate. So CTA is North America's largest technology trade association. Our members are the world's leading innovators. Those include startups all the way up to global brands. Together, we help to support 18 million American jobs. We also own and produce the CS trade show, which some of you may know. We have, as an organization, taken a very comprehensive approach to energy efficiency, and I, in my role, have overseen our work, which spans from public policy at different levels of government, federal, state, international, to industry standards. We use our industry standard setting capability to come up with standard ways of measuring energy use in products and equipment in our industry, which obviously is necessary for policy and programs. We conduct a lot of research and analysis that relates to energy use in the products in our industry, as well as consumers' perceptions of energy and environmental issues in general. And every 3 years for the past 15 years, we've produced an energy use study as part of our research and analysis initiative. We are now working on our 5th such study due out at the beginning of this summer. But we haven't only focused on the product level efforts, as important as they are. We also take a look at the corporate activities of our members and the carbon emissions reduction initiatives that they have. And we produced our 2nd annual report on that front on greenhouse gas emissions of our members last December. And the good news there is that as our industry has grown during the past few years, and really for quite a long time, we've seen a trend downward in emissions from our industry sector. So that's good news, along with the energy efficiency improvements. So undergirding all of these activities at CTA is certainly a spirit of partnership and collaboration. Indeed, that's what the Alliance strives to foster and pursue in its work. I would say the perspective that CTA brings to the table in this discussion and in general on energy efficiency is one of a trade association that has been on the vanguard of energy efficiency policy as it relates to end-use products and equipment, and obviously the consumers who use them. I certainly look forward to getting into the details, but that hopefully is a helpful overview to start.
No, that's terrific. Thank you. And you all bring very different perspectives to the conversation. So the next question, I'm going to go back to Bob and we'll go around again, is just to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that your sector is facing as you try to scale and deploy. And, if we are at a global conference, so if you're speaking about North America markets or markets in other parts of the world, feel free to differentiate or explain those differences.
Well, I can dig in on that. I mean, I guess, first the perspective, I'm largely talking about things from a North American perspective, although I think the structure and the way that we finance projects, applies globally and has been done so. So I think, expect that to change over time. But I think in terms of barriers, I'm talking about the North American market and coming at it from the perspective of project finance and really energy as a service, the market that we operate in. I think it's a large and growing market. There's a lot of customers out there that are having challenges getting capital budget allocation to implement energy efficiency or renewable energy projects, or maybe they aren't getting enough to get after things at the scale and speed that they would like. So it's an exciting time, but there's also a lot of confusion out in the marketplace. I think the energy as a service market really lacks a lot of standardization that, if not addressed, could limit its impact. And I think, you all see that there's a myriad of different energy as a service options out there. There's lighting as a service, cooling as a service, heat pumps as a service. I think anything you could think of in terms of energy efficiency or clean energy, if you looked it up, you could probably find an as a service offering out there. And it speaks to the opportunity, but I think it also creates a lot of confusion, particularly for customers and for investors. And I think of historical analogies and think back to the early days of banking in the US. So back before the National Banking Act was passed in the late 1800s, there were over 8,000 different entities that were issuing currency in the country. It was chaotic, inefficient, unwieldy, and ultimately was replaced by a single national currency. And energy as a service is a little different, but it's chaotic and unwieldy, and at times has a little bit of the Wild West flavor to it. So I think that can be a challenge. However, if you step back and, particularly look at things right now and the moment that we're in right now, which is an incredible moment for ESG investment, incredible opportunity. I think we have and really can see what our single national currency is in terms of energy as a service, and it's sustainable energy. You look at all the projects that are done, energy efficiency or renewable energy, a common denominator really at their core, and often at their mission, is sustainability and sustainable energy. And so standardizing energy as a service around sustainable energy, I think, can unify the industry. And it also can provide customers and investors with, I think, a lot of certainty about what to expect from service providers, which is that they should be getting a pay-for-performance measured service where, regardless of the types of energy assets that are installed, there's ongoing measurement, be it for a kilowatt hour of electricity saved, a therm and natural gas saved, even getting into water savings. And if you do that, if you're billing and setting the as-a-service model around a cost per unit of savings or renewable energy generation, you get to a unifier that can help scale deployment. Because if you're charging on a cost per kWh saved, you can bundle in a lighting project with a chiller or pumps and motors. So it allows you to start to piece together different upgrades at an individual facility. It allows you to piece together upgrades across a campus or a portfolio, and you start to get to scale. And if you keep in mind the sustainability side of it and focus on carbon, energy efficiency and renewable energy are incredibly unique in terms of the perspectives that they bring to ESG investment right now. You see a lot of things out there about green bonds and other ESG investments where it's really a financing instrument that has some environmental measurement bolted onto it after the fact. Energy efficiency, it comes at things where you're including the measurement of annual energy savings or renewable energy generation. You're getting those units, you can translate them into CO2 reduction. And doing that, I think, starts to provide the level of standardization and really clarity that's needed for customers to accelerate the deployment of energy efficiency. So, that's hopefully a path forward to what I think is the biggest barrier that we're facing.
Thank you. And I have some follow-up questions, but I'm going to come back when we go into a deeper dive. So thank you, Bob. Brian, so tell us a little bit about the barriers you're seeing across the many countries that SEforALL works in.
Yeah, so we're mostly working with policymakers and decision makers, investors, and the big challenge that we see, similar to Bob, it's really about confusion, and it's an overload of information, a disconnected narrative, and not knowing who they can trust, what they can trust, and coupled with that, many of the countries that we work with don't have the capacity, the know-how, or the resources to actually be able to make those decisions. So, being able to then really take the information, the best information. This is part of our goal, is to say, well, what is a best-in-class energy as a service model? What's the best-in-class building code? What's the best-in-class fuel economy standard? And how can we take this information and create a narrative that people can trust and know how to make decisions off of? Recently, someone in our community said, well, we're one of the least photogenic sectors there is. And it's true. How do you take a photo of energy efficiency? And the light bulb has been used, and a few other things, but for the most part, we're quite unphotogenic. And so at SEforALL, we're trying to really help on the communication side of this as well. One of our recent campaigns we started was called "This is Cool," and this is a way for us to visualize solutions on the cooling side, sustainable cooling solutions. But more is needed across the energy efficiency sector, and we're certainly looking to make that clear narrative for decision makers and policymakers, really.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, Doug, now your turn. What do you see as some of the challenges and barriers? And
Sure. Well, first, I don't think we have the photogenic problem that Brian mentioned. In fact, we make devices that take photos. People can relate to the products of our industry for sure. But as we've been involved in energy efficiency, particularly public policy, concerning energy efficiency, I can think of at least 3 challenges that we faced. One is reflective of our own industry. We're an industry, I think, that defies traditional approaches by its very nature. Consumer technology is defined by rapid innovation. Our products exist in a dynamic marketplace. We're a highly competitive industry. We face significant time to market pressures and cost pressures. New products get introduced, and there are rapid rates of market penetration of those new products or new categories. We see rapid transition from one technology to another. And so as policymakers and the energy efficiency community in general look at our industry, it is a struggle to take conventional approaches and apply them to a sector such as ours and hope that it keeps pace. We have to think outside the box, if you will, like a lot of our member companies do as they innovate. And how we meet this challenge is to come up with and focus on market-oriented voluntary approaches and programs, which I'll hope to get into in some detail during the discussion. A second challenge speaks to the global nature, obviously, of our industry, as well as the energy efficiency community itself. We have been challenged over the years. Bob mentioned in the banking history at one point there were 8,000 entities issuing currency. Well, pretty early on in my involvement in energy efficiency, it seemed like there were 8,000 jurisdictions proposing energy efficiency regulations for one or more products of our industry. So that has been a challenge over the years. In some cases, it's better now. In other cases, it's still a challenge. But in any case, we try to meet the disparate need or interests on energy efficiency by consolidated approaches, scaling up and not scaling down, actually. It's better, in our case, if we pursue national, if not international, approaches to saving energy in categories in our industry. And lastly, I think a third challenge would be misaligned approaches that could happen over time in different regions of the world. And those misaligned approaches and requirements that are needed to bring products to market around the world for a global industry do incur costs. They can present barriers to trade. And we want to save energy, we want to innovate, and we want to support free trade. So we think we can do that with certain approaches. And we were certainly happy to see here in North America, the new NAFTA, if you will, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, including more provisions regarding those kinds of barriers in the agreement itself.
Yes, no, I watched that as well. And through the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, I sit at a U.S. Trade Representative Environmental Products and Services Council, and we've been following that very closely. So let's, do what Doug suggested. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about policy and the types of policies that have either worked very well or things that you struggled with. I'm going to go back to Bob first. But Bob, one of the questions I had for you, because you talked a lot about energy as a service and described it, but it often makes me think of the ESCO model, energy service company model. Can you just talk before you get into the policies about how it's similar or how it's different with how ESCOs might, work with their customers?
Yeah, no, it's a key question. So I'd say the as a service model is really a hybrid of traditional third-party project finance used for solar PPAs, so that third-party ownership model, but it also does leverage and includes some of the elements of traditional energy service company performance contracting, particularly the integrated approach to combining multiple measures and leveraging the measurement and verification protocols that have now been in place for several decades to measure and verify energy. But some of the key differences are, unlike a traditional energy service company performance contract, you have a third-party owner of the assets. Most of the traditional ESCO projects, you have the customer financing the project. It sits on their own balance sheet. They're either paying for it through their own funds or through a tax-exempt lease or bond. But that's a separate arrangement where they have a hell or high water type payment to a financing entity for a loan or a lease, and then separately have a contract with an energy service company that's primarily a front-end engineering, procurement, construction contract that involves the implementation of projects. There is some ongoing performance guarantee that the energy service company provides the customer, but it's generally set in the neighborhood of about 90% of the expected savings. Under energy as a service, you have a third-party owner that bills the customer based on realized measured performance. So that's a difference. It's a connection of the technical and financial services together. And the payments are based on, again, units of energy savings. So it goes up and down a lot more like a utility bill. And then there's also typically an element of de-risking where rather than underwrite a project to 90% of the expected savings, under an energy as a service contract, you should have the service provider underwriting to 100% of the expected savings that are laid out in a detailed energy assessment. So you have a service provider really, if you think of it in that 90% example where it's a traditional ESCO performance guarantee is 90% of expected savings, under energy as a service, you get that extra 10% that gets brought into a project that's added revenue. It helps customers get more done, and I think has some of the benefits of the third-party financing models where you have alignment of interest between the financer owner and the customer. So hopefully that answers it. But it's a combination, and at Metrus, and I know it's the same for other as a service providers, we work with a lot of the ESCOs that have been doing the great work under performance contracting for something that partnership than a different type of offering really in many ways.
No, that was really helpful. So, okay, so now back to the question at hand. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about some of the policies that have worked well to expand and accelerate deployment of your model?
Yeah, and maybe I'll think about it. Some of it policies, some of it maybe more business models or innovation. So again, I've been talking about solar PPAs. I think that has been transformational in the world of renewable energy, and I think is a great policy business innovation example for energy efficiency to scale deployment. It really, through third-party power purchase agreements, it showed the customers don't need to buy solar panels, they can buy solar power, and that's a game changer. So I look to that. And then maybe, policies are important, but I also am impressed by what organizations like We Are Still In, now America Is All In, have done over the last 4 years, where largely private sector driven, although there's state and local governments involved, the commitments, the action, and the forward progress that was made by that organization, really private sector led, at a time where, frankly, the federal government was AWOL when it relates to environmental policy, is something that is impressive and I think is a model that we look at. And in terms of, I guess, maybe what hasn't worked as well, on the policy side, tax treatment for energy efficiency has always been a challenging area. Back when the tax code was established, no one thought of energy efficiency as its own asset class. If you look right now, light bulbs are depreciated over 39 years, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that can be a problem and can really lead to some, adverse incentives for investment. There are some changes that are afoot. The Real Estate Roundtable has their EQIP bill that they've helped lead that's been introduced. I know the Alliance and groups like SEforALL have been involved, and that it looks to provide a more uniform 10-year depreciation schedule for energy efficiency assets. So I think there's some hope there, but I think tax policy certainly hasn't been all that supportive for energy efficiency over the years. And then also, I think the early steps thinking about carbon neutrality weren't helpful and are in need of reform. And I think you're starting to see that with science-based targets and groups like the World Wildlife Fund and others starting to think about what really is net zero and how should it be calculated. Because in the early days, there was carbon neutrality could be achieved by purchasing offsets that are thousands of miles away from where customers are consuming energy, and really, I think, led to a lot of false victory celebrations early on. And it's important that we get it right now in terms of sending the right signal. So that's another area that I don't think it's worked, but I see some promise.
Oh, there's so much in there. That's really terrific. Great way to get us started. And we're going to come back to some follow-up questions there. Brian, love to hear from you.
Yeah, so the way I like to think about it is there's pluses and minuses to going in with a policy approach, and maybe starting off with one thing that I've seen go bad, trying to do what's great, which is back in the mid 2000s, there was a group working together with India to put a building code in place. And of course, you take the best in class building code, ASHRAE 90.1, and you figure out, okay, let's figure out how to get that to work for India. But anybody that knows ASHRAE 90.1 knows that it's a very complicated, complex code that has been built up over multiple decades in the US and North America. And so when it actually hit the ground and it was ready for use in India, well, it wasn't being used by local cities or states. It was really complex and really only addressed a small percentage of the building. So they realized, well, it was something that they needed to work on. So they finally 10 years later, 2017, they came out with another code that was very much focused on how do we get it into the States? How do we make it work for India? How do we break out some of the complexities that India wasn't used to or ready for? And so the point being that, if you're just going to have a code in place or a policy in place that affects 1% or even 0.5% of the energy use in a certain sector, it's not going to be very impactful. But if you turn around and make something a little bit simpler that can affect 50, 60, 80% of the sector, it's going to be much more impactful. Our partners through the Energy Efficiency Accelerator platform has been working with countries. The Building Efficiency Accelerator, as an example, has been working at the city level and have had national, subnational interactions, realizing that there's certain parts of this building policy world that needs to be dealt with at the national level and other bits that need to be addressed locally. And they've been able to put better codes in place, actually investment projects at the city level and tracking their progress. Similarly, the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, GFEI, they've done what's necessary to put fuel economy standards in place. And that's not just replicating the fuel economy standards of Europe or the US in every country. No, it's doing the baseline studies. It's figuring out what is feasible. in other countries around the world. Similarly, the Industrial Energy Accelerator, they're bringing ISO 50001. They're bringing, energy management to industry around the world. So it's, like I said, there's a lot of, information overload. But when you have partners like this that can bring sort of a consistent approach, but addressing local needs, I think that's what I've seen has been working really well. But not just bringing the best-in-class code and saying it's going to work because it works here, it will work there. But actually saying, well, let's follow what is needed locally and bring the best of the best-in-class as opposed to bringing the best-in-class over.
Right. Well, what you said too, it's all about building trust and kind of, filtering through all the information and helping those cities or those national governments feel that they're getting specialized information based on the best global information we have.
So they'll trust it and use it. Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to come back to you, Brian, with some follow-up questions. Great. But Doug, would love to hear from you at this point too on policy.
Sure, and just to pick up on that theme, as we tackle, again, from the consumer products perspective, energy efficiency, we're having these discussions around the world, and more often than not, the questions are the same. We just want to make sure as much as possible that we get innovation-friendly policies that are aligned around the world. The idea or the concept of accelerating energy efficiency certainly has to start with keeping pace with the industry or the sector in question. I mentioned a few minutes ago the nature of our industry and how rapidly things change. But that said, we have seen and experienced and certainly participated in programs here and around the world that do keep pace with change in our industry. One example it's heavy in North America, but also has been implemented elsewhere around the world is Energy Star. It's a prime example of a voluntary market-driven program with an international dimension too, as I mentioned. It's a government industry partnership at its core. It's been around, about 30 years now. And for us, it captures a broad range of products. It benefits by strong participation by manufacturers of products sold globally. It's well recognized by consumers. The consumer research studies keep showing that. It offers a competitive incentive to our industry, which is highly competitive to begin with, to compete for energy efficiency, to earn that Energy Star designation. And of course, when it comes to energy use and products and equipment, the program takes a holistic approach, not just one mode, but looking across the usage modes of that product or piece of equipment. Secondly, I would also highlight something that's more recent, but essentially a third way, if you will. We've had traditional regulation, of course, as a policy tool for many years, Energy Star for 3 decades. But for several years now, we've had a third approach called voluntary agreements, energy efficiency voluntary agreements, which have been implemented in Europe and Asia Pacific, and here also in North America for several product categories in the consumer technology sector. These VAs or voluntary agreements are private sector driven initiatives for the most part, although government and non-industry players do play a part in these agreements. They can be more effective than regulation because they afford both government and industry more flexible opportunities to achieve energy savings and to do so quickly. I think there's a strong argument and a track record to show that savings are achieved more rapidly as a result of some of these voluntary agreements than could have been achieved through traditional regulatory methods. But that said, over those several years of experience with these voluntary agreements, we found that there's certain, crucial ingredients, key elements. Certainly, the requirements of the agreement have to have some rigor. You have to have built-in flexibility for an innovative industry that's constantly changing. You have to account for the development of new features and functions and services, and build that into the agreement. We've literally done that through a new features process. We also learned from the energy efficiency advocates and government regulators that we needed elements that are typical of regulation built into these voluntary programs as well, verification, transparency, and enforcement mechanisms. So with these kinds of elements, we think voluntary agreements, along with Energy Star program or similar programs around the world, are a great complement and really make the difference in accelerating energy savings and obviously emissions reductions by extension in our industry. In terms of what's not as impactful or what may not be as successful in the long run, I still would point to some examples of traditional regulation, which has been tried in our sector. It's not to say there's not a role. In fact, we've supported it in some categories. But knowing that product definitions change on a regular basis in our world, that presents a basic fundamental problem with specifying something in a regulation when the very definition of that product is going to change. You have to account for the convergence of different features and functions. You have to account for new things happening. So with these technical and market complexities, it is a challenge if that's the only tool in your toolbox. But that said, we certainly advocate for more than one tool in the policymaker's toolbox nowadays. Thankfully, there are at least 3 big ones, and as they can be applied to products and equipment, including in our industry.
Well, can you just give me one example, or just a theoretical example, if not an actual example, of one of these voluntary agreements internationally for a product sector?
Sure. Well, we've CTA. We've been deeply involved in 4 different ones in 2 categories in 2 countries, specifically in the United States and Canada, along with our partners NCTA, Cable Labs, ACEEE, and NRDC in the case of set-top boxes. But we pursued voluntary agreements for paid TV set-top boxes. That's about an 8-year-old initiative at this point. About 6 years old, we have about a 6-year track record now with a voluntary agreement for small network equipment, modems, routers, and the like for in a residential setting. And right now, we're actually working on the elements of a voluntary agreement for televisions. Each one of these product categories, by the way, is obviously not limited to North America, although the agreements that we're involved in are focused in North America, but they're products of interest to the energy efficiency community around the world. So the 2 that we've done have been very successful in achieving savings in a very short period of time. They've even been able to tackle products that are already out in the market. Because if you think of our industry, of course, everything's connected and driven by software in many cases. And we found in the early days of a set-top box agreement, we could do a firmware download that would improve the energy efficiency of products already in the home. So the creative element of these VAs is something to appreciate as well.
Thank you. And we'll come back maybe and talk about that a little bit more in a few moments. All of you have focused on partnership, public-private partnership in some way. And Bob, I was definitely impressed in some of your comments about what is happening in the private sector and how the private sector is driving renewable energy procurement, energy efficiency, productivity, and energy productivity, improvements in sustainability and decarbonization in transportation fleets, and more to come. And I was just wondering, now that we are shifting yet again to another level of ambition in the private sector, how you see those trends from, your customer involvement, and, how do you think your customers that are taking on those challenges are going to be able to meet them?
Yeah, I think, I expect it only to accelerate. I think there's been a lot of great work over the last few years, but you look at it now and I think, almost a third of the Fortune 500 companies out there now have net zero targets. And from, I think, our collective perspective here and everything the Alliance is working for, there's no way any of them are going to hit any of those targets without a massive amount of energy efficiency. So I think there should be a lot of activity over the coming years, with energy efficiency being the quickest, most cost-effective thing that can be done to get to these net zero targets. So I expect to see that accelerate. And I also think that the world of sustainability is going to start to take on more importance. You see a lot of with Sustainability Accounting Standards Bureau and other more international entities too, you're seeing a lot of climate-related financial disclosure that's going to go on. So I think this is becoming more and more real for companies. And I think everyone is going to start to need to have a real action plan for sustainability. And it's going to start to drive action, and it's going to happen a lot quicker than it has happened over the last decade or more. And, we are starting to see this, in addition to customers that are having net zero targets, there's customers that are focusing in on their manufacturing. We do some work with Daimler. We have some projects with them that are part of their net zero manufacturing initiative. So I think a lot more of it is going to come. And speaking to public-private partnership, we're excited about the Open Back Better bill and the elements there that I think will bring some of this to the state levels, to leveraging the state energy programs and doing that in a way where you'll get some 4-to-1 ratios in terms of investment coming in from the federal government, but also a lot of the private capital that's out there waiting to invest in ESG and energy efficiency. I think there's a lot of banks, financial institutions that are looking for ways to put money to work. And I think programs and policies like that can bring in the private sector are going to really have a major impact.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to Open Back Better because we want to talk a little bit about the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan and other initiatives that can help deploy efficiency. But first, I'm going to go back internationally a little bit. Brian, you talked about Sustainable Development Goal 7 and I believe 7.3. For those that might not be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, can you just take just a minute and explain that, but then talk more specifically about those goals?
Yeah, certainly. So United Nations got together with all the countries, and we're looking for a way to have a series of goals that would make our lives better. And so there's a whole series of sustainable development goals that are surrounding health and education and poverty alleviation. And number 7 happens to be sustainable energy for all. 13 happens to be about the climate and emissions. So when we think about the climate hearings, obviously Sustainable Development Goal 13 is the key one, but energy is such a big player in so many of the sectors that SDG 7, and actually the pin that I'm wearing shows SDG 7 at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we see that if you have sustainable energy and you can power a healthcare facility, guess what? You're now going to be able to provide healthcare services. If you can put energy in a school, children can learn. And all of these help create a better society for all of us. And we see that with energy efficiency, which is SDG 7.3. If we're able to increase the efficiency, you can think of it as either being greater productivity, which is more service for the same amount of energy, or greater efficiency, which is the same service for less energy. And certainly the way that they're tracking SDG 7 is all about economic output and the energy used to drive that economic output as an economy. But when we talk about from the building sector or transport sector, it's about the output or the services delivered. So that energy as a service model that Bob's talking about, if he's able to deliver more service for less energy, that's a huge benefit for achieving SDG 7.3.
Great, thank you. So now a question for all three of you, and we're still in the COVID-19 health pandemic and crisis, and our economies, in different parts of the world. I mean, obviously, it's just devastating to hear the news about India and Brazil and other countries that are really struggling right now to address the pandemic. But we will all eventually be moving out of this period, and there are many countries, including the United States, the European Union, and many others that are thinking about COVID-19 economic recovery approaches, or in some parts of the world, they're calling it green stimulus. So here in the United States, it's all wrapped around a conversation on infrastructure, and depending on who you ask, it can be very broad. Infrastructure could include healthcare as much as it includes energy and traditional infrastructure like ports and roads and bridges and airports, things of that nature. So we're in the United States having a very active conversation about how do we advance our economy, create jobs, and in particular for the energy efficiency sector that saw most of the job losses overall in the energy sector due to COVID. How do we get those jobs back? And then how do we position ourselves for growth? Because energy efficiency jobs, as was already said, they can be in every community, and the access point to get into the sector is very broad. It can be technical, it can be customer service, it can be finance. So there's so many opportunities to get involved in the energy efficiency sector as a worker. So how do national policies like what we're discussing now in terms of our national infrastructure investment plan and policy plan help overcome some of the challenges that you had mentioned before? Or are there particular things in the proposals, whether they be, the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan, or things that are being considered in the Congress, spearheaded by Republicans? There are many different types of initiatives out there that can be helpful, and I'd love to hear from your standpoint what the U.S. or other governments can do as they're thinking about either green stimulus or COVID-19 economic recovery, can both, address those objectives at the same time as helping to deploy energy efficiency. So maybe I'll start with Bob.
Yeah, well, I think, touching on all the different elements you mentioned, energy efficiency always makes sense from a job creation and economic development and growth perspective. So, now more so than ever, it's critical in the U.S. and I think all over the world. And then you couple that with the climate crisis and the need to act urgently. So it makes sense what we're trying to embark on here in the U.S. And the price tag, I know, is big, but I think if you look at the cost that we're already paying in terms of climate change on an annual basis, those numbers are staggering. So that it's a big price tag, what's been put forward in terms of an infrastructure plan, but I think in many ways it's relatively cheap compared to the problems that we have, whether it's climate change or whether it's what went on in terms of reliability of our grid and what happened in Texas. We're already paying this, and I think there's a tremendous need for it. So I think on that front it makes a lot of sense. I mentioned Open Back Better and some plans that might get funneled into it. It's obviously an area of focus for the Alliance. It'll be interesting to see how things come together. There's a lot of different bills out there, and whether and how they'll all be integrated will be interesting to see what happens. One area that we're looking at, and I don't know if there's as much clarity, but when there's talk of a clean energy standard and working to decarbonize the grid, how that'll flow down to utilities and how that'll impact utility programs, which aren't at the federal level, but at the state and local level, is something that we're looking at. Where just from our perspective, if you look at our investments, a lot of them are in places where there's a higher cost of energy. And if you look at the cost of energy with the carbon content in terms of what we're reducing per $1,000 of investment, looking at that efficiency of carbon reduction, it's lower in some of the higher cost energy areas where it's a little bit easier to do projects. And then in parts of the country where energy prices are lower and you have a higher carbon mix in the grid, it's tougher to do projects. So we're interested to see how some of these policies evolve to actually provide some incentives there. Where do utilities start looking at programs where rather than, or maybe it's not rather than, maybe it's alongside a kWh savings, will they start to look at CO2 savings and incentivize projects that way, which could have a big difference. But those are the areas that we're thinking about.
Yeah, so you mentioned a few times now, Open Back Better, and not to get into too much, the technical aspects of it, but can you just repeat again the concept? And this is something that the Business Council for Sustainable Energy has also supported. So we're very hopeful that this alliance and efficiency sector-led proposal can make it in whatever package Congress enacts?
Sure. I think at the heart of it is trying to bring programs to life, or to really, maybe not to life because they're existing, but to expand what they can do at the state level where there's existing state energy programs, and to provide in some funding that does come from the federal government that would flow through to the states. But part of it would be looking for a 4-to-1 type leverage of bringing in private sector money as well. And some of the details are still being fleshed out, but part of it is also looking at, should some of the federal money go for maybe some of the resiliency and infrastructure elements that have paybacks that are, quite long, 40, 50-year type payback upgrades that are critical from a sustainability perspective, but also a resiliency perspective. And maybe the private sector money goes towards more of the energy efficiency upgrades and others that are more within the term of a typical financing, say 15, 20 years or less. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes together, but it's really looking to provide some added stimulus and momentum behind these state level programs and areas that are key. And getting back to your comments on COVID, after times where local budgets and authorities have been hit and strapped with losses in tax revenue. So it's important on multiple levels.
Yes, very much. So Doug, some of the areas in the American Jobs Plan, plus, our many proposals, again, trying to address COVID-19, do more than just funding, right? A lot of it is about education and market transparency and some of the things that you and Brian have talked about. Just wondering, when you look out at the different proposals that Congress and the administration are considering now, are there any things that you think would be particularly helpful?
There are 2 points I want to make. One on the infrastructure topic. Infrastructure can mean a lot of different things, but we're keen on broadband infrastructure. We know how important connectivity is in general, and especially during the pandemic, how important connectivity has been for us to carry on, or a lot of us to carry on anyway, with jobs and work and school. Connectivity also has a relationship to energy efficiency. Certainly some power is needed the more things are connected, but connectivity can also beget energy savings to the extent that things are networked. You see new opportunities for a systemic approach to energy efficiency, and there's been a lot of talk and discussion about that even earlier in this forum. Separate from that, the topic of funding, I'm grateful that my organization does not engage in soliciting funding or funds from government to do things. We do things anyway, but funding is being allocated to programs. Programs need funding to exist. We recognize that. But I guess the element I would inject into that discussion would be, hey, it's great to make sure these programs are funded, but when it comes to energy efficiency policies and programs, let's also not forget opportunities to improve those programs. There are a lot of great programs out there. I talked about Energy Star in particular, 3 decades old now, but any program 3 years or 3 decades old needs to be evaluated. There are always opportunities to wring costs out, to ensure that the program is as streamlined as possible, to make sure that that program is as attractive as possible to market players. So CTA has been very involved in discussions concerning existing policies and programs of the US government in particular, but I think in general around the world, we've also engaged in policy discussions in Brussels and before the European Commission. So there's always room to improve policies and programs, in addition to ensuring that they have adequate funding.
Thanks, Doug. So Brian, kind of more of the global perspective, as you can either share perspectives about what SEforALL has seen as interesting or potentially impactful from the green stimulus programs that have been proposed or starting to be enacted, or you can take it in a different direction, but would love your thoughts.
Yeah, we've put together what are called Recover Better guides for the developing countries, and I think central to that is recognizing that sustainable energy is critical for actually improving economic competitiveness of countries. And when we think specifically about energy efficiency, one thing's for sure is that energy efficiency will not become that stranded asset. So when Bob was talking about the low cost markets at high carbon intensities, guess what? Those are what's potentially the stranded assets in the future. And energy efficiency investment will not be that. But as Bob mentioned earlier in the session, what we do need energy efficiency recognized as is an infrastructure investment. So if these Recover Better plans do recognize energy efficiency as an infrastructure investment, those will be the cost-effective measures that will deliver economic competitiveness. And the actual result of that, the IEA has estimated that energy efficiency is half of the clean energy transition, half of what's needed beyond what's currently in play in terms of achieving the Paris Agreement. So the studies are out there, the data's out there. We know that energy efficiency jobs are local, cost effective, and we know that they're not going to be stranded. So there's a real big set of wins there.
Great. And we just have a couple of minutes left, and we do have a question in the chat that came in early. So I want to ask that, and then depending on how much time we have, I might go around with like a really quick response on kind of what you're looking for. I want to end on an optimistic and forward-looking note. What are you looking forward to this year? So the question is for either Brian or Bob, are either of you looking at preventative maintenance, coil cleaning, filter replacement, and the like of cooling equipment as contrasted to equipment retrofits for energy efficiency gains?
Brian, do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I think you're dealing with it day in, day out.
Yeah, the answer is we do. We look at both. So there's preventative maintenance that's part of projects that we do. Sometimes that can relate to upfront investment that we make. Also, as part of the projects that we do, one of the other things that I neglected to mention that are typically paid for through an energy as a service offering is some form of added ongoing maintenance that's over and on top of the routines that would typically be done. So lots of times that gets covered. And then of course, we're looking at, pure retrofits as well.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, from my side, it's if you look at our This Is Cool campaign, you'll see that we really focus on two different types of solutions. There's the technology solutions and the services ones. And of course, in that services ones, the maintenance is one really critical sustainable cooling solution. We don't think of it as maintenance, we think of it as a solution.
Great. Okay, so we have, just under a couple minutes left. So let me go around. What are you looking forward to this year? So Bob, start with you.
I think it's just energizing every day to see companies that are getting into the game with net zero targets and everything that's going on right now in terms of financial disclosure, thinking about what net zero means, how that is going to be measured and monitored. It's exciting, and particularly I think for all of us here who've been working in energy efficiency for a while, I think it's going to leverage a lot of the work that's been done before. So, looking forward to all that.
Great. Doug, how about you?
Well, there's a lot I'm looking forward to this year, but when it comes to energy efficiency, I'm certainly looking forward to the publication of our latest energy use study. And that's important for us because that's a census of energy use, if you will, in our sector. And I'm not aware of any other industry that's done this for itself. Like I said, we produced 4 of these in the past. This will be our 5th one. We've been doing it for 15 years, every 3 years. And it's really great when you have that amount of data to offer up to the energy efficiency community, including policymakers, so they can see and track and understand progress. The interesting thing this time will certainly be how we used our products this past year. They may be more efficient across the board, but boy, by this token of this very conference, and we're all online here, we've been using our products a lot more. So I expect that'll show up.
Yes, and just your mention of broadband expansion, that's very, very important. And as the moderator, before we go to Brian with the last word, I'll just say I'm looking forward to kind of moving forward on the infrastructure conversation and enacting some federal policies. I don't know yet what the scope and breadth of them will be, but I'm confident that something will happen this year. So Brian, what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, I have to say I'm really looking forward to a sea change, and really looking, that I see that this year with the UN hosting the high-level dialogue on energy for the first time in 40 years, and then COP26 in Glasgow hosted by the UK, these two are great opportunities for all of us, making sure that our countries are committing to energy efficiency and doing that through the energy compacts and doing that through the nationally determined contributions for climate change. I think this is a year where we're going to see a big set of changes because of those two meetings as well.
Yeah, we'll be there with you, Brian. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy, the Alliance to Save Energy, the 3% Club, the accelerators will all be there together, and hopefully, again, more of the business community, because as you said, all of you, it's really about public-private partnership and the opportunity to use the government actions to leverage the private sector investment and private sector activity that we've seen. So with that, I'm going to close this panel. I again want to thank the Alliance to Save Energy for the opportunity to bring this discussion to you, and wish everybody a continued great EE Global 2021. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.